The lieutenant slammed Emily Carter against the nurse's station with one hand, his badge pressed into her collarbone like a weapon. "You think a piece of paper protects you?" he hissed. Around them, the ER had gone completely still. Monitors beeping, a patient bleeding 3 beds away, every nurse frozen. Emily didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her eyes tracked his gun hand, his stance, the angle of his weight distribution, the same way she'd tracked enemy combatants in places this man had never heard of. Kane thought he was looking at a frightened nurse. He had no idea what was looking back at him. If this story has you gripped already, follow my channel so you don't miss a single part. Hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The emergency room at Blackstone Memorial Hospital in Redwood Falls, Colorado, ran on controlled chaos. That was the only kind of order it ever had. On any given Tuesday night, the ER might hold a construction worker with rebar through his thigh, a teenager in respiratory failure, 2 overdoses, and a domestic violence case that nobody wanted to document too carefully. The staff learned early to move fast, ask fewer questions than they wanted to, and never show the kind of exhaustion that made patients nervous. Emily Carter had worked the night shift for 3 years. She was 31, medium height, with the kind of lean build that came from habit rather than effort. Her brown hair was almost always pulled back before she even walked through the front doors. She wasn't the loudest nurse on the floor. She wasn't the one who remembered everyone's birthday or organized the potluck sign-ups in the break room. She was the one you wanted next to you when something went wrong, because nothing in her face changed when it did. Her coworkers knew almost nothing about her life before Blackstone. She didn't bring it up. When people asked, she said she'd done some time in the military, medical side, and then changed the subject. Nobody pushed. Night shift nurses developed a kind of professional courtesy about personal history. You didn't dig unless someone opened the door. The door stayed closed with Emily. She'd been working a 12-hour shift that was already 9 hours old when the ER entrance slammed open at 11:47 p.m. 2 patrol officers came through first, half carrying a man whose left arm hung at a wrong angle and whose face was a map of recent violence. Behind them came Lieutenant Victor Kane. Kane was the kind of man who entered a room like he owned the lease. Broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his late 40s, with a face that had settled into permanent dissatisfaction. He wore his uniform like armor and his badge like a weapon, which, Emily would learn, was functionally accurate. He scanned the ER the way cops scanned unfamiliar territory. Fast, dismissive, already deciding what mattered and what didn't. What didn't matter, apparently, was the staff. "I need this man assessed and cleared for processing," Kane announced to no one in particular, pushing to the front of the intake area. "Tonight, we're not waiting." Emily stepped forward from the triage station. "Sir, I need you to let us get him onto a gurney first. His arm looks, I wasn't talking to you." Kane didn't look at her when he said it. He was already scanning the room for someone with more authority, someone with a title attached to their name that he could use as leverage. "I'm the charge nurse tonight," Emily said, "so you're talking to me." That made him look. He took her in, the ponytail, the scrubs, the calm, and something shifted in his expression. Not respect, the opposite of it. "You're just a nurse," he said. "Stay out of police business. Patients come first. That's hospital policy." She kept her voice level, not defiant, not apologetic, just factual. Kane laughed once, short and humorless. He turned to the officer on his left and said something low that Emily didn't catch, but both officers smiled. Then he stepped back and let the medical team do their work, because he'd already made his calculation. She was manageable. She was small. She was an obstacle he'd deal with if necessary. But she probably wouldn't be necessary. He had found what he thought was an easy target. He was wrong in every direction. Bam. The suspect's name was Marcus Webb, 34, prior arrests, currently in Kane's custody on an assault charge from earlier that evening. His arm was fractured, radial, probably from impact, not a gunshot, though Emily noted 2 older bruising patterns on his ribs that were inconsistent with anything from tonight. She documented them without comment. She always documented without comment. Webb was scared. Not of Emily. Of the 2 officers standing at the curtain edge, watching. He kept his eyes on them in a way that had nothing to do with concern about his arm. "Does this hurt?" Emily pressed lightly on the swelling. "Yeah," he said, then quieter. "They can hear you in here." "The curtain's closed," he swallowed. "I didn't touch that guy. They had me in the car already." "I'm going to need radiology to look at this arm," Emily said. She met his eyes once, brief, steady. "I'm going to write down everything I observe. That's standard." He understood. She could see it. Kane appeared at the curtain edge before she'd finished her assessment. "How long?" "As long as it takes to do this right. He needs to be processed. He needs an X-ray and a splint before anyone moves him anywhere." She didn't look up from Webb's arm. "If you transport him with an untreated fracture and he develops complications, that becomes a liability issue for your department. So I'm going to do my job." Kane was quiet for a moment. She felt his eyes on her back. "Fine," he said. 30 minutes. He left. Emily kept working. Webb exhaled slowly beside her. That should have been the end of it. One difficult encounter, easily filed under cops, can be territorial and moved past. Emily had dealt with worse. She'd dealt with considerably worse, in places where the stakes were measured differently than a Colorado hospital at midnight. But Kane came back. He came back 4 days later, asking for the medical records of a patient who had been treated and discharged. A separate case. No active investigation Emily could identify. When the charge nurse on duty refused on privacy grounds, Kane spent 20 minutes in the administrator's office and left with a form that looked like a subpoena but wasn't one, exactly. Emily's colleague described it to her in the break room, hands still a little unsteady. "I don't know if he can actually do that," the colleague said. Her name was Petra Novak, 10 years of nursing, genuinely unflappable until tonight. "He probably can't," Emily said. "Did you document the request?" No, I didn't think. Document it now. Date, time, what he asked for, what he showed you, everything." Petra looked at her. "Should I be worried?" Emily considered the honest answer, which was yes, and gave the more useful one instead. "Document everything. That's the first step." She went home that night and opened her laptop. She'd kept a log since the first night. Brief, factual, time-stamped entries in a secure folder with a password Petra would never guess. Kane's name appeared 4 times in it already. She added a 5th entry. Then she opened a different application, one with an encryption protocol that most people in Redwood Falls didn't know existed, and typed a short message to a contact she hadn't needed in almost 2 years. Possible pattern developing. Monitoring. Will update. The reply came in 40 minutes. Copy. Keep logging. Don't escalate alone. She closed the laptop and went to bed. She had a shift in 7 hours. Kane's visits became a rhythm. Once a week, sometimes twice. He had a rotation of tactics that he probably didn't think of as tactics, just tools. He would arrive and ask for records on patients who had no open legal cases. He would linger near the nurse's station, uniform presence functioning as low-grade intimidation. When refused, he escalated to administrators. When administrators pushed back, he implied connections to city council members, which was sometimes bluster and sometimes not. He began to target Emily specifically. It wasn't dramatic at first. A complaint filed with the hospital's nursing director, vague language about uncooperative staff, obstruction of a law enforcement officer's duties. The director, a man named Harlan Pitts, who had spent 20 years managing up rather than sideways, called Emily into his office with the energy of someone defusing a bomb he was also responsible for building. "Lieutenant Kane has some concerns," Pitts said carefully. "I'm aware," Emily said. "He feels that you've been difficult during his visits. I followed hospital protocol during every interaction." "Yes, I'm sure you have." Pitts shuffled papers in a way that communicated nothing except discomfort. "But Kane has relationships in this city that... Look, Emily, you're a good nurse. You're one of the best we have on nights. This isn't about your performance." "What's it about?" Pitts put the papers down. "Kane wants you off the ER floor when he has active business here. He's made that a formal request." Emily looked at him steadily. That request asks me to be removed from my assigned position because a police lieutenant finds me inconvenient. When you put it that way, is there another way to put it? He didn't answer, which was, itself, an answer. The second complaint was filed 11 days later, and this one had teeth. Kane had obtained statements from 2 officers who claimed Emily had interfered with patient processing, delayed law enforcement operations, and, this was the one that landed hardest, failed to alert police when a patient made statements that could be considered threatening. The third point was fabricated. Emily knew it because she knew exactly what that patient had said, and she had documentation to prove it. But documentation required someone to read it. And right now, the people in positions to read it were the same people Kane had been carefully cultivating for months. "We have to put you on administrative reassignment," Pitts told her. It was a Thursday. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Temporarily, while the complaints are under review." "Administrative reassignment," Emily repeated. "You'd be in the records office, still full pay. It's just while Kane gets whatever he came here for." Pitts flinched. "That's not—" "I document everything," Emily said. "I want you to understand that." She stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out. In the hallway, she passed Petra, who read her face and opened her mouth. Emily shook her head slightly. "Not here," and kept walking. Outside, in the employee parking structure, she sat in her car for 3 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel. Not crying, not angry, exactly. Running calculations. Kane had gotten her removed from the ER. He had filed false complaints. He had used his badge and his political connections to push her sideways because she was an obstacle, and he'd grown impatient with working around her. He had done all of this because he believed she was exactly what she appeared to be. A night shift nurse who was stubborn about paperwork and didn't know when to step back. He didn't know about Fort Carson. He didn't know about the 18 months in regions that didn't appear in her service record because her service record had been classified at a level Kane had never operated near. He didn't know about the intelligence training or the documentation protocols she'd learned from people who used documentation as the difference between a mission success and a war crime accusation. He didn't know about the network she still maintained, quietly, because some networks didn't dissolve just because you changed careers. Emily took out her phone and typed a longer message this time. Escalation confirmed. Lieutenant Victor Kane, Redwood Falls PD. Pattern: repeated unauthorized records requests, filed false complaints, achieved my removal from ER assignment. Documenting for 17 days. Full log attached. I believe this is connected to something larger than individual misconduct. She attached the encrypted file. It contained 73 entries. The reply came faster this time. Stand by. This just got handed up. Emily started her car and drove home. She spent the next 6 days in the records office. It was quieter than the ER, significantly quieter. She organized intake forms and cross-referenced billing codes and answered the phone when it rang, which was 3 times a day on average. The woman who normally worked the office, a gentle records clerk named Bev, seemed delighted to have company and spent most of the first day explaining the filing system in thorough detail. Emily listened carefully. She had always been good at listening carefully to things that seemed unimportant. On the third day, she noticed something. It was small, the kind of thing you only caught if you were looking at volume patterns across extended time, rather than individual files. Certain patient records were being accessed after discharge at an unusually high rate. Not Emily's former patients. Patients who had come in during the shifts she'd been working to exclude her from, and who shared, across 4 cases, a common thread she couldn't immediately name. She cross-referenced quietly, didn't flag anything, added 4 lines to her log. On the 5th day, she passed Kane in the hallway outside the administrator's wing. He saw her. Something satisfied moved across his face. "Records office suiting you?" he said. "Very much," she said. "Interesting place." He laughed the same humorless laugh she'd heard the first night. "Learn your place. You'd be surprised how smooth things get." Emily smiled at him. It was a completely genuine smile. "I'm sure," she said, and kept walking. Behind her, she heard him say something to the officer with him. She caught 2 words. "No problem." She filed that in the log too. On the 7th night, Marcus Webb came back. Not as a patient. He came in through the front entrance, civilian clothes, arm in a proper cast. He stood near the intake desk looking uncertain until Petra spotted him and came over. Emily watched from the doorway of the records office, which had a partial sightline into the waiting area. Petra led him to a corner. Emily couldn't hear the conversation, but she watched Petra's posture change, a shift from professional curiosity to something more careful. After 10 minutes, Webb left. Petra stood still for a moment, then looked up and found Emily across the room. Emily walked over. "He wanted to know if the nurse from before was still here," Petra said, low. "The one who treated his arm." "What did you tell him?" "That you were still in the building." Petra hesitated. "Emily, he said Kane told him when they were processing him that if he talked to hospital staff about anything, he'd be charged with additional counts, like a warning. Did Webb say what he was being warned not to talk about?" "Just that it wasn't the assault case." Petra looked at her. "He seemed scared. More scared than he did when he came in with a broken arm." Emily thought about the 4 patient files, the access pattern, the things she couldn't name yet because she was missing one connection. "Document what he told you," Emily said. "Exactly as he said it, in your own words. Put it somewhere personal, not the hospital system." "You're making me nervous." "You should trust that feeling," Emily said. "But don't act on it yet, just document." Petra nodded slowly. She'd learned in the past 3 weeks that Emily's instructions were worth following precisely. That night, Emily typed a message with 4 more specific names and case numbers attached. The response came back in 11 minutes, which was fast, and it contained one line that told her everything had changed. Remain in position. Federal interest confirmed. Stand by. But on the 9th day, Kane came for the records himself. He arrived at 9 p.m. with 2 officers and a folder of paperwork, walked past the front desk without signing in, and pushed through the door into the records office where Emily was the only person present. "I need the discharge files for these patients," he said, dropping the folder on the desk in front of her. "Tonight." Emily looked at the names on the list. 3 of the 4 she'd flagged, plus 2 she hadn't seen before. "This isn't a valid subpoena," she said. "It's a court authorization. A court authorization for records access requires a case number, a judge's signature, and proper service to hospital administration. This has a case number and a signature, but the service was never logged with administration." She looked up. "I know because I log incoming legal documentation as part of this position." Kane's jaw tightened. "You are pushing me." "I'm reading your paperwork." "Emily." He put both hands on the desk, leaned forward. "I've been patient with you. That's done. I have the authority to compel these records. Through proper legal channels, yes." She didn't lean back. "Show me a properly served subpoena and I'll have the files pulled in 40 minutes. "I'm not waiting 40 minutes. "Then you're not getting the files tonight." The 2 officers behind Kane shifted. One of them was young, maybe 25, already looking uncomfortable in a way that the older one wasn't. Emily noted it without showing that she'd noted it. Kane reached across the desk and put his hand on her folder, the documentation folder she'd been building, the printed backup of the encrypted log. "What's this?" "Personal notes," she said. He picked it up. "I'm going to need to review this." "You don't have the authority to take personal documents from an employee." "I'm making it my authority." She let him take it. She watched him tuck it under his arm. She watched him turn to the younger officer and say something too low to hear. She had let him take it because what was in that folder was a copy. The original, with 7 additional days of entries including tonight, was in 3 encrypted locations that Kane didn't know existed and couldn't access. "This conversation is over," Kane said. He straightened his jacket. "Get used to the records office." After he left, Emily sat for exactly 2 minutes. Then she opened her phone and sent one message. "He has escalated to physical intimidation and document seizure. Request is, how long?" The answer came back in 4 minutes. 72 hours. Hold. She put the phone in her pocket. She pulled up the patient access log she'd been quietly studying for 9 days. She added 3 more data points. Outside, through the narrow window high on the records room wall, she could see the parking structure. Kane's patrol car was still there. The 2 officers stood beside it. The older one was smoking. The younger one was looking at his phone. Emily watched until the car pulled away. Then she went back to work. She had 72 hours. She knew how to wait. She'd spent time in worse places than a hospital records room, waiting for things to move that couldn't be rushed. The difference between this wait and those was that this time, she wasn't operating alone. This time, something was already in motion. Something that had been set in motion the night she typed the first message. The night she sat in the parking structure with her hands on the steering wheel and decided that documentation was the only weapon she needed. She was almost right. She would need one other thing before the end. But that was still coming. In the hallway outside the records office, she heard footsteps. Not Kane's. Two different people, unhurried, stopping just outside the door, then moving on. Emily didn't look up from the screen. She typed the last entry of the night. Day 9. Files requested improperly. Documentation seized. Response expected within 72 hours. Pattern now complete. Kane is not operating independently. She saved it, encrypted it, sent it. Then she shut down the computer, turned off the light, and walked through the hospital to the parking lot. Because she had a shift tomorrow, records, again, and she needed a few hours of sleep. In the ambulance bay, one of the overnight paramedics was leaning against the rig, eating something out of a paper bag. He nodded at her as she passed. "Night, Emily." "Night," she said. She was almost to her car when her phone vibrated. Not a message. A specific pattern. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. A contact signal she hadn't felt in close to 2 years. She stopped, looked at the screen. No message, just the signal. She knew what it meant. The clock wasn't 72 hours anymore. It was shorter. She stood in the parking lot with the phone in her hand for a moment longer than she needed to, feeling the weight of what that signal meant. Not 72 hours. Shorter. How much shorter, the signal didn't say. It never said. That was the protocol. You received the compression, you adjusted your posture, and you waited with your eyes open instead of half closed. She drove home. She didn't speed. The next morning, she was back in the records office by 7 a.m., which was an hour before her shift technically started. Bev wasn't in yet. The hallway outside smelled like the overnight cleaning crew's floor solution, sharp and chemical, the way hospitals always smelled at that hour before coffee and foot traffic softened it. Emily pulled up the access log she'd been monitoring for 9 days and ran the comparison she'd been building toward. It took 11 minutes. When the pattern resolved on the screen, she sat back in her chair and looked at it for a long moment. 5 patients. Different ages, different conditions, different attending physicians. The only thing connecting them was timing. They'd all been treated during specific shift windows over the past 6 weeks. And a secondary factor she'd been trying to confirm. All 5 had come in through the ambulance bay rather than the front entrance. All 5 had at least one officer present during intake. Not Kane, not always, but always someone from the same unit. She wrote it down longhand on a notepad, the old way, because she'd been trained to maintain parallel records when digital security wasn't guaranteed. Then she photographed the notepad with her phone and sent the image to the encrypted channel. The reply came in 8 minutes. "This connects. Don't touch the files." She hadn't planned to. She closed the access log and opened the routine intake form she was supposed to be processing. Petra appeared in the doorway at 9:15, 20 minutes into her own shift, holding 2 coffees. She handed one to Emily without asking and sat down in the chair across from the desk. "Kane was in the building again last night," she said, "after you left." "I know." The overnight charge nurse, Dolores, said he went through the ER supply room, not the records area, the supply room. Petra wrapped both hands around her cup. "He had a key." Emily looked up. "Who gave him a key?" That's what Dolores wanted to know. She asked Pitts this morning, and he said it was a security arrangement, whatever that means. A key to the supply room. That was a new data point and not a small one. Supply rooms in ERs held controlled substances under separate lock, but they also held something Kane might find equally useful: patient intake paperwork that hadn't been digitized yet, handwritten triage notes, the analog layer of a hospital's intake system that existed in a gap between what was officially recorded and what wasn't. "Did Dolores document it?" Emily asked. She was going to. Then Pitts told her it wasn't necessary. Emily said nothing for a moment. She thought about the 5 patients, the shift windows, the officers who were always present during intake. "Petra," she said carefully, "is there any pattern you've noticed with walk-in patients, specifically the ones who come in through the ambulance entrance and have police presence during triage?" Petra's expression shifted. Not surprise, more like confirmation of something she'd been sitting with. There have been a few cases where the paperwork felt thin afterward, like the patient came in, got treated, and then the intake notes were just minimal, less than usual. "Do you remember any names? I'd have to look." "Don't look," Emily said immediately. "Don't access anything. If you remember something without searching, that's different. But don't go into the system looking." Petra stared at her. "Emily, what is actually happening here?" Emily thought about how much to say. Petra wasn't trained for this. She was a good nurse and a careful person, and she had the instincts to ask the right questions. But instinct and preparation were different things. Giving her more information right now created risk without giving her any protection. "I think Kane has been using this hospital for something that has nothing to do with his official cases," Emily said. "I think Pitts knows more than he's saying, and I think the situation is going to change soon." "How soon?" "I don't know exactly." Petra looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You keep saying things like that, things that sound like you know more than you're telling me." "I do know more than I'm telling you. That's not me being evasive. It's me trying to keep you out of the part that has risk in it." "I'm already in it. I'm the one who told you about Webb. I documented what he said." "I know. That was the right call." Emily held her gaze. "Keep doing your job exactly the way you always do. Don't vary anything. Don't ask unusual questions through the hospital system. If Kane approaches you directly, tell him you don't have access to the records he's looking for and refer him to administration." "And what are you going to do?" "Keep logging," Emily said. "Attack." What she didn't tell Petra was that logging was the secondary function now. The primary function, beginning that morning, was witness preparation, though she wouldn't have used that phrase out loud. She spent 3 hours in the records office pulling every legitimate document she had access to that touched the 5 patient cases, photographing each one on her personal phone before returning it to its place. The photographs went to the encrypted channel in batches. She noted timestamps, file locations, which physical cabinet held the originals. At noon, she went to the break room to eat something and overheard 2 orderlies talking about the supply room key. Apparently, word had moved faster than Pitts anticipated. Half the floor staff knew by now that Kane had after-hours access to clinical areas, and the reactions ranged from confused to quietly alarmed. Nobody knew how to raise it formally. Nobody wanted their name attached to a complaint against a police lieutenant who had demonstrated repeatedly that he could make those complaints disappear. Emily ate her sandwich and listened without appearing to listen, which was a skill that looked like passivity and wasn't. When she got back to the records office, there was a message waiting. "Access log anomaly flagged our end. Someone at your location ran an internal audit query on the 5 files in the last 2 hours. Not you. Identify if possible." She read it twice. Then she locked the records office door, which she'd never done before, and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Someone else had accessed those files. Someone inside the hospital today, after her morning review. That meant 2 possibilities. Either someone was monitoring the same pattern she'd identified and was ahead of her, or someone knew she'd been looking and was now looking at what she'd seen. The second possibility was significantly more dangerous. She typed back, "Checking. Stand by." The access log system showed individual user credentials when queried by admin-level login. Emily didn't have admin-level access from the records office, but she knew who did, and she knew that Bev, who had come in at 8 and gone to lunch at 11:30, had left her workstation logged in because Bev trusted everyone in the records office and had never developed the security habits that came from spending time in environments where trust was specifically dangerous. Emily pulled up the log on Bev's workstation, found the query timestamp, found the credentials. The query had been run on Harlan Pitts's login. She photographed the screen, sent it, then she cleared the query history, not to hide it from investigators, but to hide it from Pitts, because if he checked and found that she'd seen it, the timeline compressed in a way she couldn't predict. The response came back in 6 minutes. "Pitts is a secondary target. Do not engage him directly. You need to be out of the records office tonight. She stared at that last line. Out of the records office meant either off the floor entirely or repositioned. The channel didn't specify. She typed, clarify. The answer that came back was 3 words, ER, night shift, which meant someone had already made arrangements she hadn't been told about, which meant the 72-hour window wasn't 72 hours at all. It had been a ceiling, and whatever was in motion had been moving faster than she was briefed. She found Pitts at 2 p.m. He was in his office with the door half open, typing something. She knocked on the frame. I'd like to return to ER rotation, she said. Tonight's shift. He looked up. His expression went through several quick phases before it settled on something cautious. The complaints are administrative, and the ER is short-staffed tonight. I checked the board. Dolores is carrying a double and you're 1 body short on nights. She kept her voice straightforward, not aggressive. I'm offering to solve your staffing problem. Pitts was the kind of administrator who processed everything through 2 filters. What was it going to cost him, and what was it going to look like? Returning her to the ER contradicted the arrangement he'd made with Kane, but an understaffed overnight shift had its own liability calculation, and Pitts was aware of it. I'll need to make a call, he said. Of course, she said. She went back to the records office and waited. At 4:30 p.m., Pitts appeared in the doorway and told her without quite meeting her eyes that she was cleared to return to ER night starting at 7 p.m. Thank you, she said. Kane's going to hear about this, he said. It came out as a warning, but it had the texture of an apology underneath it. Harlan Pitts wasn't evil. He was the more common thing, a man who had made accommodations until the accommodations owned him. He probably will, she said. That's all right. She went home, slept for 2 hours, and was back at the hospital by 6:45. Dolores looked up when she walked into the ER, and the expression on her face was complicated, relieved and uncertain at the same time, the way people looked when help arrived from a direction they weren't sure they trusted. They said you were coming back, Dolores said. I'm back. Kane's not going to like it. Probably not. Dolores looked at her for a moment. She was a decade older than Emily, had spent 22 years in this ER, and had developed the kind of judgment that came from watching people under pressure for that long. You all right? She asked. Yes. You sure? I'm sure. Dolores nodded once, the kind of nod that meant, okay, I'll trust that for now, but I'm watching. Then she handed Emily a tablet and pointed her toward bed 4, where a 40-year-old man was presenting with chest tightness that hadn't resolved. Emily went to work. The first 3 hours were routine. Chest case turned out to be anxiety with a cardiac overlay, a laceration from a kitchen accident, 2 separate pediatric fevers. The ER had its own momentum, and Emily slid back into it without friction. Her hands remembered the work. Her body remembered the pace. She hadn't realized until she was back in it how much the records office had been costing her, the low-grade wrong of sitting in the wrong room for 9 days doing the wrong job. At 10:40 p.m., Kane walked in. He came alone this time, which was unusual enough that Emily clocked it immediately. No officers flanking him, no folder of paperwork, just Kane in his uniform, moving through the ER with his particular brand of ownership, scanning until he found her. She was at the nurse's station. She didn't move. He stopped 6 feet away. His jaw was working. Pitts shouldn't have put you back here. Pitts made a staffing decision. I'm covering a short shift. You think I don't know what you're doing? She met his eyes. I'm triaging patients. He stepped closer, not quite threatening. The distance between professional and personal. I pulled that folder you had. Looked through it. She said nothing. A lot of notes, he said. Very thorough. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger, but something underneath anger. Something that recognized it had miscalculated. You're a records clerk who takes very thorough notes. I was a records clerk for 9 days, she said. I'm a nurse. You're a problem. Lieutenant. She said it quietly, not as a courtesy, but as a marker, establishing that this was a formal interaction now, audible to the 3 other staff members within earshot. If you have a medical need, I'll direct you to intake. If you have official business requiring patient records, You'll need to submit proper legal documentation to administration. Is there anything else I can help you with? The muscles in his face went tight. He stood there for a beat longer than was comfortable, long enough that Dolores, at the far end of the station, had stopped pretending to look at her monitor. "You're making a mistake," Kane said. "I'll document this interaction," Emily said. "Standard procedure." He left. Dolores waited until the ER doors swung shut behind him, then walked over. "What was that?" "He came to remind me that I'm a problem," Emily said. She was already writing the time and content of the interaction into her notepad. "Are you?" Emily thought about the 5 patient files, the access log, Pitt's running queries, the signal from the parking lot 2 nights ago that had compressed the timeline from 72 hours to something shorter. "Not the kind he thinks," she said. She finished writing, folded the notepad, and went back to her patients. 40 minutes later, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She checked it in the medication room where she had 30 seconds of privacy. "Tonight, be in the ER. Do not leave the building after midnight." She put the phone away and went out to respond to a call light in bed 7. Midnight was 2 hours away. She had no way to know that what was coming wouldn't wait that long, that at 11:38 p.m., was a black SUV would pull into the ambulance bay, and right behind it, a second one, and behind that a third, and that the 2 officers Kane had sent in advance to collect Marcus Webb from the waiting room, Webb, who had come back a second time and made the mistake of asking for Emily by name at the front desk, would find themselves outnumbered before they had time to understand by whom. Emily was changing a dressing on a burn patient in bed 3 when the ambulance bay doors opened and the ER went quiet in the specific way it went quiet when something was wrong, and she looked up and she saw who was walking through the door first. She recognized him. She hadn't seen him in almost 3 years. His name was Special Agent Darius Wolk, and the last time Emily had seen him, they'd both been covered in someone else's blood in a forward operating position that didn't exist on any official map. He looked roughly the same, broader, maybe. Hair cut to the same regulation length it had been in the military, though he'd been out 4 years. He was wearing a dark jacket with a federal ID clipped to the front, and he was moving through the ambulance bay with 3 people behind him who moved the way people moved when they'd done this kind of entry before. Fast, low profile, eyes already working the room. He found her in approximately 2 seconds. She hadn't moved from bed 3. The burn patient, a man named Garrett, 51, construction work accident, 2nd-degree burns on his left forearm, looked between Emily and the newcomers with the confused alarm of someone who had come to the hospital for a medical problem and was now part of something else. "You need to step out for a minute," Emily told Garrett quietly. "Take your IV stand, walk to the family waiting area. Someone will come get you." "What's—" "Please." She met his eyes. "Now." He went. She stood up. Volt crossed the ER floor in 8 steps. Behind him, his team had already separated. 2 moving toward the intake desk, 1 positioning near the ambulance bay doors. Emily registered all of it in the peripheral way she'd trained herself to register things, the full room at once rather than the single point of focus. "Carter," Wolk said. "Wolk." He almost smiled, not quite. "You look exactly the same." "You're early," she said. "Things moved." He glanced around the ER, the frozen staff, the monitors, the 2 officers who had been standing near the waiting room entrance and were now very still. "Where's Webb?" "Waiting room. Those 2 were about to move him." Volk turned, made eye contact with one of his team members, and tilted his head. The team member went. The 2 officers tracked the movement, and one of them reached, not for a weapon, just a reach. Instinct, the beginning of an objection, and Volk's second agent was between them before the motion completed. "Redwood Falls PD?" Volk said to them. His voice was pleasant. "You're going to want to stand down. Federal jurisdiction as of—" He checked his watch. 14 minutes ago. "You don't have authority to I have a federal warrant, a RICO designation, and 4 hours of patience left in me tonight." He pulled out a document and held it at arm's length toward the closer officer. "Read it or don't. Either way, step back." They stepped back. Emily exhaled once, slow, through her nose. She was aware that Dolores was 3 meters away with both hands flat on the nurse's station and the expression of someone watching something happen that she'd half expected but hadn't fully believed would. "I need the ER locked down," Volk said to Emily. Not asking, but asking her specifically, which meant something. "Patients stay, non-essential staff can go to the break room or family waiting, and nobody goes in or out of the ambulance bay without my team clearing it." "I can do that." She turned to Dolores. "You heard him." Dolores didn't move for a half second. Then she picked up the overhead intercom handset, and her voice went out through the department, steady and practiced. "Attention Blackstone Memorial ER staff. We are entering a temporary lockdown protocol per administrative directive. All non-critical staff, please relocate to the staff break room. Patients remain in their beds. No one enters or exits the ambulance bay until further notice." It wasn't a protocol that officially existed, but Dolores had been in this ER for 22 years, and she knew how to move people without causing a stampede. But the next 8 minutes were controlled noise. Staff relocated. 2 patients who were ambulatory and anxious needed brief explanations that there was a security situation being handled, and they were not in danger, which was true in the immediate sense. Volk's team moved through the department with the efficiency of people who had done room clearances in environments where the stakes were considerably higher than a Colorado hospital. Emily stayed at the nurse's station because that was where the information was. The intake board, the patient census, the department layout she knew, and they didn't. Volk came back to her twice to ask questions. Where was the secondary exit? Was there a stairwell access from the ER? What was the layout of the supply room corridor? She answered everything. On his second return, he paused. "Your documentation sent everything through the channel, 79 entries supporting photos, access log screenshots." "The access log, PITS." "Yes." Volk's expression shifted in a way that wasn't quite surprise. "He's further in than we initially assessed." "I know." She'd understood that when she saw his credentials on the query. A hospital administrator running unauthorized record checks on files connected to a corrupt police lieutenant wasn't a man who'd been coerced once. That was someone who had been participating. "How many staff do you trust in here tonight?" Volk asked. She thought about it honestly. "Dolores, Petra's not on shift. 2 of the techs I'd vouch for. The overnight resident I've worked with twice. I don't know him well enough." "That's fine. We don't need everyone. We just need them not in the way." He looked at her for a moment. "You did good work, Carter. The documentation package was, your handler said you always ran clean logs." "Who's my handler these days?" she asked. "Because I sent to an old channel and it picked up." "It picked up because we were already watching Kane. You walked into an active federal investigation." He said it without accusation, just information. "Your logs corroborated 3 months of our work. The access pattern you found, the 5 patients, that's the piece we were missing." She absorbed that. 3 months, which meant this had been building long before the first night Kane walked through the ER doors, which meant Kane's behavior here had been the visible edge of something considerably larger. "What are the 5 patients?" she asked. Volk hesitated. Then, witnesses. In an ongoing federal case against a trafficking operation running through 3 counties. Kane was running interference, using the hospital to identify which patients were cooperating with federal prosecutors and feeding their information to the network. She'd suspected something along those lines. Hearing it stated directly still had weight. "The supply room key," she said. "He was accessing pre-digitized intake forms. The analog gap. Smart." Volk said the last word flatly, the way you acknowledged an opponent's tactic without admiring it. "He was photographing forms before they went into the system, then having them replaced with altered versions that omitted identifying details. PITS facilitated the access." "PITS facilitated a lot of things." Volk's jaw tightened briefly. "He's going to have a long evening." Kane arrived at 12:19 a.m. He came in through the front entrance, which meant he hadn't seen the vehicles in the ambulance bay yet. He was in civilian clothes, off-duty, which meant someone had called him, which meant the 2 officers who'd been in the waiting room had found a way to communicate despite being separated from their phones. He got 6 steps into the ER before he understood. Emily watched it happen. She was behind the nurse's station. Volk was positioned to the left, near the corridor that led to the supply room, talking to one of his agents. Two more federal agents were visible at different points in the department. Kane stopped. He read the room the way she'd read it when Volk walked in. Fast, total, assessing. His eyes found the federal IDs. Found Volk. Found Emily. His face went through 3 expressions in about 2 seconds. The last one was the most interesting. Not fear, not anger, but a very specific kind of recalculation. The look of a man deciding in real time whether he still had options. "Lieutenant Kane," Volk said, moving toward him. "Special Agent Darius Volk, Federal Criminal Investigations Division. I have a warrant for your arrest on federal charges including RICO conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. I'm going to need you to put your hands where I can see them." "You don't," Kane started. "The warrant is on your department's server right now. Your chief received a copy 40 minutes ago." Volk's tone didn't change. "Hands, Lieutenant." Kane's right hand moved, not toward a weapon, toward his radio. It was a reach for communication, for backup, for the chain of resources he'd been using for months to make problems go away. "Radio's going to get you an additional charge," Volk said. Kane's hand stopped. Emily stood perfectly still behind the station. She'd spent 27 days documenting this man. She'd spent 9 days in a room she wasn't supposed to be in, reading files she'd had to approach carefully enough not to be caught. She'd taken an obscure vibration pattern in a parking lot as her signal to recalibrate. And now she was watching him realize that none of the leverage he thought he had was real anymore. He looked at her. "You," he said. The word carried a lot. Not quite hatred, not quite respect, something complicated in between. "Me," she said. He looked back at Volk. "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one," Volk said. "Hands." This time, Kane raised them. It didn't go smoothly after that, because these things never did. The first complication arrived when one of Volk's agents came from the corridor leading to the supply room with a second man. Not medical staff, not a patient, a man Emily had never seen before, middle-aged, in street clothes, who had apparently been in the supply room corridor when the lockdown started and had not relocated to the break room the way the overhead announcement requested. He looked at Kane across the department. Something passed between them. Recognition, assessment, a rapid private calculation. And then the man moved sideways, fast, toward the treatment bay area where 2 patients were still in their beds. He reached into his jacket. Emily was already moving. Not because she'd made a conscious decision. Her body had moved before the thought completed, the way her body always moved in the half-second of clarity that preceded real danger. She came around the end of the nurse's station and closed the distance to bed 2 and 4 steps. The man was reaching across the patient in bed 2. A teenage girl, here with a broken wrist, terrified, pressed back against the rail. And his hand had something in it that wasn't a weapon, but was a phone. And in that situation, a phone and a weapon produced the same outcome, information out, which blew the operation. Emily caught his wrist on the extension, applied pressure at the specific joint angle she'd been taught in a building that also didn't exist on official maps, and the phone hit the linoleum. The man tried to turn into her. She redirected his momentum, got his arm behind his back, and had him face down on the floor beside bed 2 in a motion sequence that took approximately 3 seconds and made a sound like controlled falling. The girl in bed 2 made a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a gasp. "You're okay," Emily said, not looking away from the man on the floor. "You're not in danger. Look at me." She waited until the girl looked at her. "What's your name?" "Sadie." "Sadie, I need you to press the call light and keep your eyes on me, okay? Don't look at him." Sadie pressed the light with her good hand. Volk's agent was there in 4 seconds, which was fast. And he looked at the man on the floor and then at Emily with an expression she recognized. Not quite surprise, but the upward revision you made when your prior estimate had been off. "He's got zip ties in his right jacket pocket," Emily said. She'd felt them when she redirected his arm. She stepped back and let the agent take over, then straightened up and checked the room. Kane was cuffed. Volk was on his radio. The 2 Redwood Falls officers from earlier were against the far wall with a 3rd agent watching them. The man from the corridor was being secured on the floor beside Sadie's bed, while Sadie stared at the ceiling and breathed deliberately, which Emily noted and appreciated. "That's a good breathing pattern," Emily told her. "Keep doing that." "Was he going to hurt me?" "No. You were just in the way of something he wanted to do. It's done now." The girl's eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. 17, maybe. The wrist fracture had come from a fall during soccer practice. Emily remembered the intake. Here alone because her parents were 20 minutes out when the lockdown started. "Am I still getting the cast tonight?" Emily almost laughed. "Yes, absolutely still getting the cast." "What?" Wolk found her 7 minutes later when the immediate movement had resolved into the organized aftermath. Agents coordinating, Kane being moved toward the ambulance bay exit, the two officers being separated and questioned individually, Dolores managing the patient side of the floor with the focused competence of someone who had decided the only thing to do was keep working. "The man you took down," Volk said. "Terrence Holt. He's a mid-level operator in the trafficking network. We've been trying to place him for 6 weeks." Emily waited. "He was in the supply room accessing files," Volk continued. "Our working theory is Kane called him before he came in. Holt's job was to clear anything incriminating before we could pull it." "The pre-digital intake forms." "Yes, he had a bag with him." Volk paused. "Your file, specifically, was in the bag, the one Kane took from you 2 nights ago." She hadn't expected that. The copy he'd taken, she'd assumed he'd reviewed it and dismissed it since she'd allowed him to take the copy precisely because the copy was incomplete. But using it as a document to be destroyed meant he'd identified it as evidence, which meant he'd understood more of what she'd been doing than she'd given him credit for. "He knew I was building something," she said. "He knew. He just didn't know how far along you were." Volk looked at her steadily. "How long have you been running counter-surveillance on him without backup?" 27 days documented, the first 3 before I reached out. 30 days alone. I wasn't sure what I had at first." Volk was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was deciding how to say something. "Your handler said you used to run solo observation for extended periods in theater. He said you were one of the better ones. But Carter, this wasn't— I know what this wasn't," she said. "I was a civilian in a hospital, and I used the tools I had. If I'd escalated wrong, he'd have had me fired and the documentation would have been meaningless." "I know." He wasn't arguing with her. "I'm saying it because someone should. You ran 30 days and you're still standing in the middle of a secured federal operation, and you look like you could do another shift." She did feel the tiredness. It was there, behind everything else, the long, specific fatigue of sustained vigilance. But there was no productive thing to do with it right now. "What happens next?" she asked. "Kane gets processed tonight, Holt as well. We have a team moving on 2 other officers right now, the ones connected to the intake pattern you flagged. And," Volk's expression shifted slightly, "we're bringing in Pitts." "Where is he?" "At home. We have someone there." He looked toward the administrator's wing, the darkened offices at the end of the corridor. His cooperation determines how this goes for him. He wasn't the architect, but he wasn't nothing either. Emily thought about Harlan Pitts calling her into his office with his careful language and his shuffled papers. The small accommodations that accumulate until they own you. She didn't feel sorry for him exactly, but she understood the mechanism. "What about the 5 patients?" she asked. "The witnesses." "Federal protection, as of tonight. They've been notified." Volk pulled out his phone, checked something. "The trafficking operation itself, that's a separate ongoing investigation. What we did tonight is remove Kane's interference apparatus. The case against the network continues." She nodded. There was a shape to this that she recognized from other work in other places. "You didn't take down everything at once? You removed the piece that was blocking the process, and the process moved forward, satisfying in the structural sense, not in the human sense, where you wanted everything resolved in one night." "I have a patient," she said. "Burn case, bed 3. He went to the family waiting area." Volk looked at her for a beat. "Go." She went. Garrett was in the family waiting area with his IV stand and an expression of someone who had genuinely no idea what to make of the last 40 minutes. He was 61. She'd misread his age earlier, with the weathered hands of someone who'd done exterior work his whole life and the particular patience of someone who knew how to wait out weather. "You're the nurse from before," he said. "Yes. Sorry for the wait. Let me take a look at this." She checked the dressing on his arm, checked the IV line, took his vitals. Everything was fine. The burn was second degree, properly treated. Nothing the last hour had changed about his medical situation. "What happened out there?" he asked. "Federal situation, it's handled." "Were those guys... Was somebody arrested?" "Yes." He looked at her arm where she'd grabbed the floor of the nurse's station, coming around it fast. A minor scrape from the corner she hadn't noticed until now. "You do that?" "Occupational hazard," she said. He studied her in the way that older men sometimes did. Not invasively, just with the attention of someone who had been around enough to recognize that people weren't always what they presented. "You're not just a nurse, are you?" She applied a fresh dressing to his arm. "I'm definitely a nurse," she said. "Your skin is healing well. We'll keep this covered, and you're going to want to follow up with your GP in 5 days." He accepted that, didn't push. She walked him back to bed 3, got him resettled, made sure the night resident knew where to find his chart. Then she went back to the nurse's station and stood for a moment looking at the ER, the agents, the staff trickling back from the break room, the patients who had been through something strange and were processing it in their individual ways. Dolores moving through it all with the steady authority of someone who had decided that continuity was its own form of care. Sadie, in bed 2, had her cast being applied by the overnight resident. She gave Emily a small wave across the department. Emily waved back. Her phone vibrated. She checked it. A message from Petra, who was off shift and had apparently heard something through the staff notification system. "Are you okay? What's happening?" Emily typed, "ER is secure. Kane is in custody. I'll explain tomorrow." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, "I knew something was going to happen. I didn't think it was going to be whatever that was." Emily pocketed the phone. She picked up the intake board and started checking who needed attention. The real work, the ongoing work, the work that didn't pause for federal warrants or men from her past walking through ambulance bay doors. She was 3 patients in when Wolt came back one more time. "We're clearing out," he said. "Agents will be in and out over the next few days for follow-up, but the immediate operation is complete. You'll be contacted formally in the next 48 hours. You'll need to provide a statement. The documentation will be entered into evidence. The whole process." "I know the process," she said. "Right." He paused. "Carter, Kane filed 2 formal complaints against you and had you removed from clinical duties. Those complaints are going to need to be addressed." "I know." "The federal record will show that the complaints were fabricated as part of a broader pattern of obstruction. Hospital administration is going to receive a formal communication in the morning." He looked at her steadily. "Pitts won't be here to complicate things." She hadn't thought about that yet. What happened to the department after tonight? Who ran what? Who was accountable for what? It felt distant, the administrative aftermath, the part that came after the part she'd been living in for 30 days. "There's one more thing," Volk said. He was looking past her, toward the ambulance bay, where the last 2 agents were pulling equipment. His expression had a quality she remembered from the field. The delivery face, the one people wore when they had something that was both important and complicated. "Kane had someone inside the hospital," he said. "Not Pitts, someone with direct access to the clinical floor who was feeding him real-time information about staff movement and patient status." She waited. "We don't have an ID yet, but based on the communication pattern, it was someone on the night rotation. Someone who knew your schedule well enough to tell Kane exactly when you were in the records office and what you were doing." He met her eyes. "They knew you'd gone back to the ER tonight. Kane was informed before he walked through that door." The ER hummed around her. Monitors, the distant sound of the Sadie's cast being set. Dolores checking in on bed 6. All of it familiar. All of it suddenly with a different texture. Someone on her floor, someone she'd been working beside for weeks, possibly for months, who had been watching her and reporting back. She looked at the staff in the department, Dolores at the far end, the overnight resident, 2 techs, the unit secretary, a young man named Grant who'd been here 8 months, the paramedic team rotating through. "You can't tell me who," she said. "We don't know yet. We're working the communication logs." Volk's voice was careful. "Don't confront. Don't change behavior. Act normal." "Act normal," she repeated. "I know." His expression acknowledged what he was asking her to do, to return to the floor she'd been standing on for the last 3 hours, with the same people she'd been working beside, knowing one of them had been selling her movements to a man she'd just watched be arrested, and to act normal. She'd done harder things. She'd done considerably harder things, but those had been in places she'd chosen to go. This was a hospital in Colorado where she'd thought she was just trying to take care of patients. 48 hours, Volk said. "We'll have the communications analysis done." He went. The ambulance bay doors closed behind him. Emily stood at the nurses' station. She looked at the board. She looked at the staff. She looked at the department she'd been removed from for 9 days and had fought her way back into tonight, and which now contained, somewhere in its ordinary rhythm of beeping and footsteps and clipboard sounds, someone who had chosen Kane over the people they worked beside. She picked up a chart. Grant, the unit secretary, looked up from his monitor. "Everything okay?" "Yes," she said. She looked at him, really looked, the careful attending look she used with patience. 23, maybe 24. 8 months on the floor. Kane's information had been precise enough that someone had to be embedded rather than recently recruited, which argued against Grant on time alone, but "Emily," Grant said, "you need something?" "Bed 8's vitals haven't been updated since the lockdown," she said. "Can you remind the tech?" "Sure." He reached for the phone. She turned back to the board. 48 hours. She could do 48 hours. Across the department, Dolores caught her eye with the specific look that 22 years of night shifts produced. The look that said, "I know something happened, and I know you're not going to tell me yet, and I'm trusting you to tell me when it matters." Emily gave her a small nod. Dolores went back to work. Emily went back to work. At 2:14 a.m., a new patient came through the ambulance bay. Car accident, 2-vehicle, minor injuries, shaken. Emily moved to intake. She asked the right questions, did the assessment, directed the patient to imaging. Standard, routine, the work that didn't stop. Her phone was in her pocket. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a loose thread, present, not pulling yet, waiting. At 2:31 a.m., it vibrated once. She checked it in the medication room. The message was from the encrypted channel. Not Volk. A different sender tag, one she didn't recognize, which meant it had been escalated above his level. Communications analysis expedited. 4 hours, not 48. Prepare. She read it twice. Locked the phone. Stood in the medication room for exactly 10 seconds. Then she walked back out to the floor because there were patients and there was work, and whoever was watching her needed to see exactly what she always looked like. A nurse, doing her job, giving nothing away. 4 hours. She checked the clock above the nurse's station. 2:33 a.m. That put it at 6:30. Shift change. Shift change at Blackstone Memorial happened at 7 a.m. Not 6:30, which gave Emily an extra 30 minutes she hadn't calculated for, and which she spent in the medication room doing inventory counts that didn't need doing because she needed something to do with her hands. And medication counts were the kind of task that looked purposeful without requiring her full attention. 4 hours had become 4.5. The encrypted message had said, "Prepare," which was not a specific instruction, which meant the preparation was internal. Posture, patience, the particular kind of stillness that looked like nothing from the outside. She ran through the staff on shift. Dolores was finishing up, would be gone by 7:15. The overnight resident, Dr. Alec Morrow, she'd finally gotten his name from a chart at 3 a.m., was writing discharge notes. 2 techs. Robbie, who had been here 6 years and whom she'd trust with anything, and a woman named Farida who had transferred from a Denver hospital 4 months ago and whom Emily knew almost nothing about. Grant at the unit secretary desk. 2 paramedics rotating through, but they came and went and didn't have sustained access to floor information. She kept coming back to Farida. Not because of anything specific. Because of the negative space. 4 months on the floor overlap with the period when Kane's intelligence about staff movements had become precise. And Emily genuinely could not account for her in the way she could account for the others. Robbie talked too much and meant well and had the transparency of a person who had never needed to hide anything. Grant was 23 and mostly worried about whether his parking validation would go through. Farida was quiet, professional, and Emily had worked beside her a dozen times without learning a single personal detail. That could be privacy. It could be the kind of reserve that some people carried into workplaces. It could be something else. Emily put the medication count away and went back to the floor. At 5:50 a.m., Petra arrived early. She came through the staff entrance with her bag over one shoulder and her coat still on, looking like someone who had not slept well, which tracked with her 2 a.m. text. She found Emily at the nurse's station and stopped. "Tell me something," Petra said, low. "Kane was arrested. Federal charges. The hospital is going to look different by the end of today." Petra processed that. She was the kind of person who processed things by going very still for a moment. "Pitts?" "Also." "Oh." She sat down slowly in the chair beside the station. "Oh, that's a lot." "Yes." "The staff here, does anyone know yet?" "Not formally." Emily looked at her. "Petra, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not change how you're acting right now. Can you do that?" The stillness again. Then, "Yes. There's someone on the night floor who is feeding Kane information. We don't know who yet. Federal communications analysis is running. It's going to come back in the next hour." Petra's eyes moved. She couldn't help it, a quick involuntary scan of the department. Then she pulled them back. "Someone here. Someone I work with." "Possibly someone you work with regularly." Emily kept her voice flat and low. "I need you to just be normal. Do your hand over, take your patience, be Petra." "I'm always Petra." "I know." Petra was quiet for a moment. Is it someone I'd be surprised by?" "I don't know yet." That landed. Petra absorbed it with the expression of someone realizing that the ground they'd been standing on had a different composition than they'd thought. At 6:10 a.m., the day shift began filtering in. The energy of the department shifted. The particular change of shift restlessness, people wanting coffee, people wanting to get home. The overlap of outgoing and incoming that turned the nurses' station into organized traffic. Emily's phone stayed quiet. At 6:33 a.m., it vibrated. She was in the corridor. She looked at the screen. Analysis complete. Do not act. Team en route. ETA 22 minutes. She pocketed the phone. She went back to the nurses' station. She completed her outgoing notes on every patient she'd managed through the night, clear and thorough, each entry time-stamped correctly, because that was what you did at the end of a shift, regardless of what else was happening. And because the patients were real and their continuity of care was real regardless of the federal operation layered over the top of everything. She was on her third chart when she felt it. The specific awareness of being observed. Not paranoia. A grounded perception, the result of having spent years in environments where the difference between the two was consequential. She didn't look up. She finished the chart entry. She moved to the next. The observation continued. She placed it somewhere to her left and slightly behind, in the range of the supply room corridor entrance. She completed the fourth chart, stood, turned naturally to put the tablet on the rack. Farida was at the corridor and entrance, watching her. Their eyes met. Farida looked away first, down at her phone, a casual redirect. She moved toward bed 9 where her morning patient was waiting. Emily stood for a moment longer than necessary. She picked up a clipboard and walked to bed 6, which put her on the opposite side of the department, with a sightline that included both the nurses' station and the supply room corridor, and she began doing a final morning check on her discharge patient in bed 6 while watching. 3 minutes later, Farida went into the supply room. Emily did not follow her. She counted to 30, then walked to the nurses' station and found Robbie, who was doing his own handover. "Hey, is there something in the supply room that needs 2 people to access? I think Farida went in for something." Robbie didn't look up from his notes. "There's a restock on the IV supplies. She mentioned it earlier." "Which cart?" "The blue one, I think." Emily nodded. She went back to bed 6. Her patient, a 60-year-old woman named Marguerite, here overnight for observation after a minor cardiac event, genuinely doing well and ready to go home, was watching the morning news on the small mounted screen. "You look tired," Marguerite said. "Long night," Emily said. She checked the monitor, made a note. "Dr. Morrow is going to sign your discharge before 8. You have someone picking you up?" "My daughter's on her way." Marguerite looked at her. "Is something happening? There was all that activity last night." "It was a federal matter. It's resolved." "Were you involved?" Emily managed something that wasn't quite a smile. "I was working." She finished Marguerite's notes and went back to the station. Farida had not come out of the supply room. The supply room restocks took 5 minutes if you were moving efficiently, 8 if you weren't. Emily had been watching for 11. Her phone vibrated. On site. Wait for entry. She exhaled slowly, put the phone away, picked up the next chart. 4 minutes later, Volt came through the ambulance bay doors. Behind him were 2 agents she hadn't seen last night, different people, which meant this was a second team, a follow-up unit. He scanned the department, found Emily, and gave a single small nod. She tilted her head very slightly toward the supply room corridor. He moved. The agent spread without appearing to, the same choreography as last night, different room. Petra, across the department, caught Emily's eye and immediately looked back at her own work. Robbie was oblivious, still on handover notes. Grant had gone on his morning break. 30 seconds later, Emily heard Wolk's voice from the corridor. Not the words, just the tone, the particular calm that meant he was identifying himself and issuing instructions. Then Farida's voice, higher, a single sentence Emily couldn't parse. Then quiet. They brought Farida out through the corridor 2 minutes later. She wasn't cuffed. Not yet. The process was more procedural than that at this stage. But she was flanked by both agents, and her face had the look of someone who had made a series of decisions over a long period of time and was only now arriving at their collective consequence. She was 28. Emily had not known that. You learn things about people at the moment of their unraveling that you hadn't known when they were intact. Farida looked at Emily as she passed the nurse's station. It was a direct look, not hostile, not apologetic, just direct. A look that acknowledged that she knew Emily had figured it out, and Emily had known she was being watched, and that both of them had spent the last hour in a mutual awareness that neither had acted on. "I needed the money," Farida said. Not to the agents, to Emily. Emily looked at her steadily. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that would be useful, and because Farida deserved something more honest than a platitude and less brutal than the full weight of what the money had cost. Farida walked out. Robbie looked up from his handover notes. He had finally registered that something had happened. Did they just... "Yes," Emily said. "Farida?" "Yes." He sat back in his chair. The look on his face was the one she'd seen before on people who discovered that a colleague had been something other than what they seemed. A specific kind of disorientation, the retroactive examination of dozens of small moments. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know exactly." "She transferred from Denver," he said slowly. 4 months ago. Emily said nothing. "She wasn't from Denver, was she?" "No," Emily said, "she wasn't." By 8 a.m., the day shift administrator, a woman named Carla Reyes, who had been Pitts's deputy and who had, as far as Emily could determine, no involvement in what Pitts had been doing, was fielding 3 simultaneous phone calls at the administrator's desk, looking like someone handed the wheel of a moving vehicle they hadn't been told was in motion. Emily went to her at 8:20 after the immediate morning rush had settled into the usual rhythm. "Who do I report patient care concerns to?" Emily asked. "With Pitts on administrative leave?" Carla looked at her with exhausted eyes. "Right now, that's me. Technically." She pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. "The board is calling an emergency session this afternoon. The chief of medicine is coming in. There are going to be several positions that need interim appointments." "The ER needs an official charge designation for the day shift," Emily said. "Dolores was running nights without the formal title because of Kane's complaints. I know. Carla lowered her hand. Emily, what happened here? Not the federal version, just what happened in this hospital? It was a genuine question from someone trying to understand the institution she'd suddenly inherited, and Emily considered how much of the answer she could give without compromising the federal process. Kane targeted this ER because it was a convenient access point, she said. He had an administrator who helped him and a staff member who fed him information. Most of what happened here happened because people were either pressured or paid. The institution mostly worked. It just had the wrong people in the wrong positions. Carla absorbed that. And you? I documented it, Emily said. You were put in the records office. Yes, and you kept documenting. That's the job, Emily said. Carla looked at her for a long moment. I'm going to need a statement from you, separate from whatever the federal investigators are collecting. Of course. And I'm going to need you to come back to the ER as charge nurse, formally, today. Emily had expected something like this, but not this fast. The day was barely started, the institution was still vibrating from the previous night, and formal appointments usually moved through 3 layers of HR before they arrived anywhere. You have the authority for that? Interim emergency appointments fall under the deputy administrator. Carla's jaw set in a way that Emily recognized. The jaw set of someone deciding that the discomfort of acting was less than the discomfort of waiting. You should have the position. You clearly know how to run that floor under pressure. And frankly, right now I need someone on the ER who isn't... She searched for the word. Compromised, Emily said. I was going to say uncertain, but yes, but yeah. By 9:30 a.m., Emily had been awake for 26 hours. She was aware of it the way you were aware of a weight you'd been carrying long enough that you'd mostly stopped noticing it. Present, structural, not debilitating yet. She'd eaten something from the vending machine at 7 a.m. and was on her 3rd coffee, the terrible hospital coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. She was at the nurse's station doing the new charge nurse handover documentation, a stack of it, more administrative than clinical, the paperwork of designation, when Petra appeared beside her and put down a slightly better coffee from the cart that the volunteers ran on the 2nd floor. You look terrible, Petra said without malice. I know. You should go home and sleep. After I finish this. Petra sat down in the adjacent chair. She was quiet for a moment, the way she got when she was building toward something. Farida, I worked beside her almost every shift for 4 months. I know. I covered for her during a break. We talked about... She told me about a dog she had growing up. People are more than one thing, Emily said. Even people who do the wrong thing. Petra considered that. Is that something they teach you? In the military? It's something you figure out. Did you like it? The military. Emily looked up from the paperwork. It was the kind of question nobody asked directly, which was usually why people didn't know. Parts of it, she said honestly, I was good at the work itself, the medical part that I liked. Some of the other parts were harder. How long? 8 years? Petra's eyebrows moved. She'd clearly assumed less. And then you came here. And then I came here. To a night shift in a hospital in Redwood Falls, Colorado. There are worse places, Emily said. And she meant it, which was perhaps the truest thing she'd said all week. At 11 a.m., the first news van appeared in the hospital parking lot. Emily saw it through the window in the break room where she'd retreated for 15 minutes to eat an actual meal. Someone had brought in sandwiches, provenance unknown, and she wasn't asking. The van was from the Redwood Falls local affiliate, and it was followed 20 minutes later by a second one from a Denver station. The story had broken. Federal charges against a sitting police lieutenant generated a news cycle with gravity, but what accelerated it was the hospital angle. A medical facility used as an infrastructure element of a trafficking network, a corrupt administrator, an informant on the clinical staff. That was the kind of layering that turned a local story into something that moved up the wire. Carla handled the media at the front entrance with the help of the hospital's communications coordinator, a young man who had never handled anything remotely like this. and was running on adrenaline and a notepad full of approved talking points that the Federal Communications Office had sent over at 10:15. Emily was not part of the media response. That was deliberate. Volk had told her in a brief call at 9:45 that the federal investigation required her name to stay out of public statements until the case entered the evidentiary phase. She was fine with that. What she was not fine with was the call she received at 11:47 a.m. from Volk, who was back at the federal field office in Denver. Kane's lawyer filed a motion this morning, he said. She had been sitting in the break room. She put the sandwich down. What kind of motion? Challenge to the warrant validity. The argument is that the predicate documentation, your logs, was obtained through unauthorized access to hospital administrative systems. She felt something go cold and specific in her chest. I used my own credentials. Every access I made was within the scope of my assigned position. I know, we know, but the motion claims that your assignment to the records office was punitive and that any system access during that period falls outside normal job scope, which means the documentation you compiled there was obtained outside authorized access, she finished. It's a stretch, Volk said. The legal team doesn't think it survives, but it needs to be addressed before we can move forward. It puts the evidentiary phase on hold temporarily. She thought about 30 days of logs, 79 entries, the photographs of the patient access records, the intake forms, the PITS credentials on the query screen, the supply room communications that Farida had been running, all of it potentially sitting behind a procedural challenge that could take weeks to resolve. What do they need from me? She asked. A formal statement detailing every access you made during the records office period, what system, what credentials, what scope of work was assigned to you in writing when you were reassigned. His voice was careful. Is there a written record of the reassignment? Pitts's name would be on it. There's a written record, she said. I kept a copy. The silence on the other end had the quality of someone recalibrating. You kept a copy of your own reassignment documentation. I keep copies of everything, she said. Emily. His voice had changed. The deliberate tone dropped slightly, something more human underneath it. Did you keep copies of everything from the beginning, including the complaint documentation that Kane filed? Yes. Including Pitts's response to the complaints? Yes. Including the meeting where Pitts told you that Kane had made the removal a formal request? She thought back to that meeting, the shuffled papers, the way Pitts couldn't meet her eyes. She had sat in her car after and typed 7 lines into her log, including a direct quote from Pitts that she'd reconstructed immediately after. The specific phrasing he'd used when he said Kane has relationships in this city that, yes, she said, I have it. The silence was longer this time. We need all of it, today. I can have it to you within 2 hours. Carter. He paused. Kane's lawyer is good. They're going to argue that you were running a parallel investigation as a civilian with no authorization, that your documentation was the product of personal bias against a law enforcement officer, and that every piece of evidence derived from your logs is tainted. Let them argue it, she said. You're not worried. She thought about the moment in the records office when she'd understood what she was looking at, the 5 patients, the access pattern. She'd been careful, not in the performative way of someone expecting to be challenged, but in the grounded way of someone who had been trained to document correctly because incorrectly documented intelligence got people killed. She'd applied that same standard in a hospital records room in Colorado because the standard was the standard regardless of geography. I'm not worried about the documentation, she said. I'm thorough. I know you're thorough. I'm asking if you're worried about the process. She understood what he was actually asking, whether she had the stamina for a legal challenge that might extend weeks, months, whether she would still be standing and cooperative and available when the case needed her to be, given that she was currently operating on 27 hours without sleep and the most consequential month of her civilian life. I'm going to go home, she said. I'm going to sleep for 8 hours. Then I'm going to compile the documents and send them to you. And then I'm going to go back to work tomorrow night. Volk was quiet for a moment. That's it? That's it. Kane is going to fight this hard, Emily. He has political connections. He had political connections, she said. He used them to file false complaints against a nurse and have her moved to a records room. And while she was in the records room, she built the case that put him in federal custody. She picked up the sandwich again. His political connections aren't the variable I'm focused on. Another pause. What variable are you focused on? The documentation is solid. The chain of custody is clean. Farida's communications have been seized. Pitts is cooperating. You told me that this morning, and you have Terrence Holt, who has every incentive to detail Kane's operation in exchange for a reduced charge. She took a bite of the sandwich. The motion is noise. Wolk made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. Get some sleep, Carter. Working on it, she said. She went home at 12:30 p.m. The drive was 15 minutes through the middle of the day. Redwood Falls in the particular flat light of a late autumn noon, the mountains visible from the highway in the way they were visible on clear days, present, large, indifferent to the scale of human activity below them. She got home, took a shower, set an alarm for 8 hours, and was asleep within 4 minutes of her head hitting the pillow. She dreamed about nothing, which was the best kind of dream. Boutique. Her alarm went off at 8:45 p.m. She sat up, took stock. 8 hours had not made a dent in the full weight of the accumulated sleep deficit, but it had put her past the point of functional impairment, which was what she'd needed. She made coffee. She opened her laptop. She spent 90 minutes pulling the complete document set: logs, photos, reassignment paperwork, complaint documentation, Pitts's written response, her own written objection to the reassignment that she'd submitted to HR and which HR had filed without action. She compiled it in the order Wolk's team would need it for an evidentiary package, chronological, with a cover document indexing each item and its origin. She sent it at 10:23 p.m. Wolk's acknowledgement came back in 6 minutes. This is comprehensive. Stand by for scheduling a formal deposition. She closed the laptop. She called Petra, who was on shift and answered on the second ring. How's the floor? Emily asked. Weird, Petra said. Good weird mostly. The day staff know. Everyone knows now. There are a lot of conversations happening in corners. A pause. Someone brought cookies. I don't know why, but someone brought cookies. People bring food when they don't know what else to do. It's a lot of cookies. Another pause. The board meeting this afternoon, Carla said they're approving your appointment as permanent ER charge nurse, like formally. It goes through tomorrow. Emily had known it was coming. Hearing it stated still had a texture to it. Not satisfaction exactly, something more structural than that. The return of something that should not have been taken. How's the patient load? She asked. Normal? Busy? 3 traumas in 2 hours this afternoon, then quiet. Robbie's managing well. Petra's voice dropped slightly. Nobody's said Farida's name out loud all day. It sits there. You know? I know. Do you think she knew what she was enabling? Like, really knew? Emily thought about Farida in the supply room. The communications Wolk's team had pulled. She hadn't seen the content, but the duration and frequency had been described to her in the brief call. 63 discrete communications to a Kane-associated number over 4 months. Daily, sometimes multiple times daily. Locations of staff, schedule changes, patient intake information, a note when Emily had been moved to the records office, another note when she'd been moved back. Farida had known. The question of what she'd understood the information was being used for was a different one, and it was one for prosecutors and courts, and whatever Farida's own account produced. I think she made a choice, Emily said. The reasons matter for the sentencing, not for the outcome. That's very practical. I'm a practical person, Petra laughed, quiet and a little tired. You really are. Then, Emily, before everything happened, when you were in the records room and Kane was in the building and things were, I kept thinking you seemed so calm, like actually calm, not pretending to be calm. How do you do that? Emily thought about it. It was a genuine question, and it deserved a genuine answer rather than the deflection she usually reached for. You hold one thing, she said, whatever the next right action is, not the whole picture, not what could go wrong or how it ends, just the next right thing to do. She paused. In the field, we called it keeping your lane. You do your job.
Your job is usually possible even when the situation isn't. Your lane, Petra repeated slowly. Okay.
Your lane tonight is the floor, Emily said. How's bed 4? Petra shifted smoothly. The specific professional gear change of someone used to moving between personal and clinical. Recovering well. IV running, fever broke 2 hours ago. Dr. Morrow ordered a follow-up culture. Good call on the culture. I'll see you tomorrow night. She ended the call. She sat in her kitchen for a few minutes with the coffee going cold on the counter. It was 10:47 p.m. Outside, Redwood Falls was doing what it did. The ambient sound of a small city at night, traffic and distance, and the occasional horn. She was thinking about the warrant challenge, specifically about Kane's lawyer's claim that her documentation was the product of personal bias. The framing bothered her not because it was accurate, but because it was the kind of argument that could take root with the right audience. The image of a nurse with a grudge, cataloging every interaction with a police lieutenant she didn't like, manufacturing a pattern from data that had an innocent explanation. She thought about the 5 patients, the access pattern, Pitts's credentials on the query, the supply room, Holt in the bag. None of that had innocent explanations. But Kane's team didn't need it to. They needed doubt, and doubt was easier to build than truth. She opened her laptop again. She went back through the logs, not because she'd missed anything, she hadn't, but because she wanted to be inside the evidence the way an opposing attorney would be inside it, looking for the seam they'd pull on. At 11:30 p.m., she found it, not in her logs, in the absence of something she'd expected to be there. She had documented the night Kane took the folder, her copy of the log, taken from the records office desk. She'd noted the time, the content, his words. What she had not noted, because she hadn't thought it mattered at the time, was that there had been a second person present for part of that interaction. One of the 2 officers Kane had brought with him, the younger one, the one who had looked uncomfortable. She hadn't gotten his name. She hadn't needed his name then. Now she thought about the way he'd looked. 25, the expression of someone absorbing something he wasn't sure how to file, not enthusiastic, not intimidated, just uncomfortable in the specific way of someone watching something happen that they weren't sure was right. Witnesses worked both ways. She looked at the timestamp on her log entry from that night. Cross-referenced with the incident log the federal team had pulled from the Redwood Falls PD system, which Wallach had sent her as part of the evidence overview. It took her 8 minutes to find the right duty roster. Officer Daniel Price, 24, 8 months on the force. She sent a message to Wolk's line. There was a second officer present when Kane took the documentation from me. Officer Daniel Price, Redwood Falls PD. He was there for approximately 4 minutes. He looked uncomfortable. I don't know what he saw or heard exactly, but if he's willing to give a statement, he corroborates the timeline independently of my logs. She hit send. Then she sat back. It was on its surface a small thing. A junior officer who'd been present for 4 minutes and might not remember anything specific. But small things had a way of becoming structural when you place them in the right position. And a corroborating witness who had no stake in the outcome and no connection to the federal investigation could be the exact piece Kane's lawyers couldn't account for. She didn't know that yet. She was guessing, based on pattern. She was usually right about pattern. The reply came from Wolk at 11:54 p.m. Price flagged internally 2 weeks ago. He came to the federal office voluntarily on day 19. He's been cooperating since. Emily stared at the message. Price had come forward on his own, which meant he'd been watching Kane's behavior from inside the department and had arrived independently at the same conclusion Emily had arrived at from the outside, which meant the corroboration wasn't coincidental. It was convergent, 2 different vantage points arriving at the same event. She typed back, "Did he witness the records office incident specifically?" The reply came in 3 minutes. He witnessed the folder removal. He documented it internally the same night. He described the exchange in detail. His account matches yours to the minute. She closed the laptop, sat in the kitchen with the cold coffee. Kane's lawyers would argue personal bias. They would argue unauthorized documentation. They would argue that a disgruntled nurse had built a case against a police officer out of professional resentment and selective interpretation. And the federal prosecutor would stand up and say, "Here's the nurse's documentation. Here is a junior officer's independent account. Here is Harlan Pitts's cooperation statement. Here is Farida's communications record. Here is Terrence Holt's account of Kane's instructions. Here's the patient access pattern that a civilian identified using only the data she was authorized to see. Here's what 30 days of careful work produces when you do it correctly." She got up, poured the cold coffee down the drain, and made a fresh cup. She was not going to sleep again tonight. She could feel it, the particular wakefulness that came when a situation was close enough to resolution that her body refused to power down. She would go in early. She would be at Blackstone Memorial by 6 a.m. She would pick up the charge documentation Carla had left for her formal appointment, and she would sign it, and she would be on the ER floor when the day shift arrived. She was running through the staff changes, the patient census updates she'd need to review, the supply inventory that Farida's arrest had left incomplete, when her phone rang. Not a message, a call. Volk's number. It was 12:17 a.m. She answered. "Kane gave a statement tonight," Volk said without preamble. She waited. "His lawyer advised against it. He gave it anyway. 3 hours with federal prosecutors." A pause that had weight in it. "He implicated 4 additional members of the trafficking network, names we didn't have, locations, a transaction record that connects the network to a separate operation we've had open for 19 months. He flipped," she said, "partially. He's not getting a walk, the federal charges stand, he's looking at significant time. But he gave us enough that the prosecutors are restructuring the case entirely. The trafficking network isn't 3 counties, it's 7. She absorbed that. The scope of it, 7 counties. An operation that had been running through this hospital and through Kane and through the access pattern she'd mapped from a records office desk with a borrowed admin login. "What does this mean for the warrant challenge?" she asked. "Kane's lawyer withdrew it an hour ago." Volk's voice had the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that had multiple layers. "With Kane cooperating, there's no benefit to challenging the evidentiary chain. The defense position shifts entirely." She stood in her kitchen at 12:17 a.m. with the fresh coffee in her hand. The motion was gone. The documentation would stand. Kane would be sentenced on federal charges, and whatever reduction his cooperation earned him would be determined by prosecutors who were operating on the additional 19 months of work his statement had just cracked open. "The case goes forward," she said. "The case goes forward." Another pause. "Emily, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." Kane's statement included, he said, specifically, that when he made the decision to escalate against you, he ran a background check. Standard procedure, he said, when someone becomes a problem. She knew where this was going. "Your background check came back clean," Volk continued. "No military record, no service history, standard civilian profile." "Yes," she said. "He said that's why he wasn't worried about you, because your record showed nothing." "That's right. Your record shows nothing because your record is classified at a level his department didn't have access to." "That's right." Volk was quiet for a moment. "He picked a fight with someone whose background he literally could not see." "He picked a fight with a nurse," Emily said. "That's what he thought he was doing." The silence on the line stretched out for 3 seconds. Then Volk said, "We're going to need your full service record for the deposition, the classified portion." "I know. It's going to become part of the federal record." "I know that too." "It means the people at that hospital are going to find out. About Fort Carson, about the other assignments." She thought about Robbie's face when Farida was walked out, the retroactive examination, the recalibrated past. She thought about Dolores, who had said, "You sure?" in the way that meant she was already adjusting her estimate. She thought about Garrett in bed 3 asking, "You're not just a nurse, are you?" with the quiet attention of someone who recognized the texture of competence operating beyond its apparent context. They would find out. Most of them had already started finding out. "That's all right," she said. "You're not concerned about—" "I'm a nurse," she said. "That's true. It's been true for 3 years, and it'll be true tomorrow morning.
Everything else is just additional context. She put the coffee down. Let the record show what it shows. Volk exhaled. Okay, then. There's one more thing. Kane's statement. You said. He said, at the end, apparently unprompted, that he wished he'd never walked into that ER. Volk's tone was careful, offering it without editorializing. He said he looked at you the first night and made a decision about who he was dealing with. And he said, a pause. He said it was the worst call he ever made. Emily was quiet for a moment. That's not comfort, she said finally. He still did what he did. The patients he exposed are still people who had their information compromised. Farida still made the choices she made.
Pitt still, I know, Volk said. It's not comfort, she repeated. It's just accurate. I know that too. She picked up the coffee again. Is there anything else you need from me tonight? No, get some rest. I will, she said, which was not entirely true but was the correct thing to say at 12:21 a.m. to someone who had been working this case for 3 months and was probably running on less sleep than she was. She ended the call. She stood in her kitchen in the quiet of a Redwood Falls night with the mountains somewhere out there in the dark. 7 counties, 19 months of separate work, names and locations Kane had carried inside the operation for however long he'd been inside it, which was long enough that his cooperation was worth something and short enough that he'd made enough mistakes for a nurse in a records room to build a case that federal prosecutors could use. She thought about the timing of everything. The escalation pattern, the warrant challenge, Kane's statement. And then she thought about something she'd been setting aside because there hadn't been space for it. The question of what came before the ER, before Redwood Falls, before the 3 years of night shifts. Kane's operation connected to something that had been running for 19 months. She had come to Blackstone Memorial 3 years ago. She had been placed here, she understood now, in the loose way that certain people were placed in certain locations after certain kinds of service, not assigned, nothing so formal, but guided, gently, toward areas that needed a particular kind of eye without being told that's what they were doing. She was not supposed to know that. She probably was not supposed to have put it together, but she had put it together, sitting in her kitchen at 12:24 a.m. with a fresh cup of coffee, because that was what happened when you gave a certain kind of mind enough data and enough quiet time. She opened her phone, opened the encrypted channel, typed one message, careful and deliberate. Question. When I was placed in Redwood Falls, was the hospital the assignment? She sent it. She waited. The reply came in 9 minutes, which was longer than usual, which meant it had been passed up. 4 words. We'll talk. Come in. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she put her phone down, picked up her coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark, understanding for the first time that the last 3 years had not been the quiet civilian life she thought she'd been living. She sat with those 4 words until 1 a.m. We'll talk. Come in. Not a denial, not a confirmation, just an acknowledgement that the question deserved a conversation that a text channel couldn't hold, which was, in its own way, the answer. She thought about the sequence, the way she'd been guided toward Blackstone Memorial 3 years ago, not explicitly, but through a series of small suggestions from people she trusted, people who framed it as a good civilian opportunity, good hospital, good community. You'll settle well there. She'd believed that. She'd been ready to believe it, because she'd wanted the quieter thing after the years of not quiet. And people who want something badly enough don't always examine the scaffolding around it. But she'd been an intelligence-trained combat medic with a classified service record, and she had been placed in an ER that turned out to be adjacent to a multi-county trafficking network that federal investigators had been watching for 19 months. Coincidence was a concept she'd been trained out of. She didn't feel angry about it, which surprised her a little. She sat with the feeling and examined it, the way she examined things when she had time to actually do it, and what she found underneath wasn't anger but something more complicated. The recognition that the work she'd done here had been real, and the care she'd given to patients had been real, and the 3 years had not been false even if their framing had been something other than what she'd understood. The work was still the work. The patients were still the patients. She'd been a nurse in a hospital. That part was true all the way through. She went to bed at 1:15 a.m. and slept 4 hours, which was not enough, but was what was available. She arrived at Blackstone Memorial at 6 a.m. to find Carla Reyes already in her office with a legal pad and 2 empty coffee cups, and the look of someone who had also not slept enough and had made peace with that. Carla pushed a folder across the desk without preamble. Formal appointment documentation, effective today, ER charge nurse, full title, full authority. Emily picked it up, looked at it, signed where it indicated. The board meeting yesterday, Carla said. They voted to issue a formal institutional apology to every staff member affected by Kane's interference. That includes the written complaints against you, the reassignment, and the documented intimidation events, she paused. It's going to be delivered in writing and read aloud at an all-staff assembly next week. Okay, Emily said. Is that enough? I'm asking genuinely. I don't know if that's enough. Emily thought about what enough meant in a situation like this. An apology from an institution that had been compromised at the administrative level didn't undo the 9 days in the records room, or the false complaints in her personnel file, or the 27 days of running surveillance alone on a police lieutenant who had federal connections she hadn't fully understood at the time. It didn't undo Farida's choices, or the 5 patients whose information had been compromised, or Marcus Webb's fear in the treatment bay. It's a start, she said. The complaints need to be formally expunged from my file, not just noted as resolved, removed. Already submitted to HR. Carla met her eyes. Done today. Then that's enough for now, Emily said. Did you? She was on the ER floor by 6:30. Petra was finishing a night shift and looked up when Emily came through the doors with the charge nurse designation badge clipped in its correct position for the first time in 37 days. Petra looked at the badge, looked at Emily's face. Something in her own face went loose with relief in a way that she didn't quite manage to control. Morning, Emily said. Morning. Petra's voice was slightly unsteady. She cleared it. Bed 2 needs a dressing change. Bed 5 is waiting on labs. Bed 7 came in at 4 with a dislocated shoulder, already reduced, monitoring for neuro. I've got it, Emily said. Go home. Petra picked up her bag. She paused at the station. The badge looks right, she said. It looks like it should have been there all along. It should have been, Emily said. Go home, Petra. Petra went. The formal sentencing of Victor Kane happened 11 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon in federal court in Denver. Emily was not in the courtroom. She had given her deposition 6 weeks prior. 4 hours, detailed, comprehensive, with the full evidentiary package entered as Exhibit C in the federal case. The testimony had covered everything from the first night Kane walked through the ER doors to the records office access pattern to the document seizure to the night of the federal operation. Her classified service record had been entered under seal and reviewed by the judge in camera, which meant it was part of the record without becoming public. She heard about the sentencing from Volk, who called at 4:47 p.m. 14 years, he said. Federal. No parole provisions until the 8-year mark, and the parole board recommendation will be shaped by the cooperation assessment. She was in the ER when the call came, standing at the nurse's station between patient check-ins. She stepped into the medication room for 45 seconds. The other officers? She asked. Sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years, depending on depth of involvement. 2 cooperated fully, which brought them down. The third didn't, and it showed in the verdict. He paused. Terrence Holt, 9 years. The trafficking network prosecution is separate and ongoing. Kane's cooperation has moved that case significantly forward. Pitts pled guilty to obstruction and accessory charges. 18 months, federal minimum security, 5 years probation, and permanent bar from healthcare administration. Volk's voice was flat when he said it. Not satisfaction, just the recitation of facts. The judge said his cooperation was a mitigating factor, but that his position in a medical institution made his culpability categorically different from a civilian equivalent. That's accurate, Emily said. Yes. A pause. Farida Saleh, 6 years, cooperated on the communications evidence which reduced from the initial charge. She gave a full account of how she was recruited. Kane used financial pressure. She had family debt, and he found it.
Emily leaned against the medication room wall. 6 years for someone who'd been leveraged into a position she might not have fully understood. She didn't feel nothing about that. She also didn't feel that the outcome was wrong. Both things were true. The 5 witnesses, she said. The patients. All 5 have been formally protected under the federal witness program for the duration of the trafficking prosecution. 2 have already testified in the secondary case. Their information is, he paused, it's been significant. The network that Kane was running interference for had been operating for 6 years. Your access pattern map was the piece that let us connect the intake methodology to the network's counterintelligence arm. She absorbed that. 6 years. A trafficking network that had been operating in 7 counties for 6 years, using a hospital's admission system as a detection tool, feeding information to the network about which patients were cooperating with investigators. And she had found the pattern from a records room desk using only what she was authorized to see. Carter, Wolk said, still here. The primary investigator on the trafficking case, Deputy Director Marcia Osei, out of the Denver field office, she asked me to pass something along. He paused in the particular way that meant he was being careful with the wording. She said the access pattern analysis you compiled will be submitted as a methodological framework to the Federal Evidence Standards Board, as a case study in civilian documentation under adverse conditions. Emily said nothing for a moment. She means it as a compliment, Volk added. I understand that, Emily said. Tell her thank you. She also wants to know if you'd be open to a conversation about a formal consulting role, civilian side, medical intelligence, your schedule, and terms. Emily thought about the kitchen table at 1 a.m. and the 4-word message and the understanding that the last 3 years had been something other than she'd known. She thought about what she'd told Petra, that she'd liked the work, the medical part, and that some of the other parts had been harder. The other parts had been harder because the other parts had asked her to operate in spaces where the human cost was immediate and unambiguous, where the distance between a decision and its consequences was measured in seconds rather than legal proceedings. Medical intelligence was different, slower, more structural, the kind of work where documentation was the weapon and patience was the skill, and you spent 30 days in a records room and the outcome was 14 years for a corrupt police lieutenant and a methodological framework submitted to a federal standards board. She was good at that kind of work. She'd always been good at it, and she'd been doing it without the title for 3 years. Tell her I'm open to the conversation, Emily said. Well, the all-staff assembly happened on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Kane's sentencing, in the hospital's largest conference room, a room usually reserved for quarterly reviews and the occasional compliance training that everyone endured and no one remembered. It was standing room when Emily arrived, which she hadn't expected. Day shift, night shift, administrative staff, the maintenance crew, the dietary team, paramedics who had no formal relationship to the hospital's internal staff structure but had heard about the assembly and shown up anyway. Carla Reyes read the institutional apology from a printed statement. It was thorough, named the specific events, named the affected staff, named the failure of administrative oversight that had allowed a police lieutenant to operate inside a medical institution with the latitude Kane had been given. It did not name Pitts because the lawyers had advised against naming him while his own legal proceedings were still active, but everyone knew who was meant. The room was very quiet while Carla read, the kind of quiet that has weight. When she finished, she looked up and said, "We also want to formally acknowledge Emily Carter, ER charge nurse, who documented the pattern of misconduct that formed the foundation of the federal case, while under administrative pressure, without institutional support, and without disclosing what she was doing to anyone who might have been compromised." Emily was near the back wall. She had not expected to be named. She registered it, the shift in the room, the attention orienting toward her, and kept her expression neutral in the way she'd kept it neutral through most of the last 11 weeks. Robbie, standing 3 people to her left, started clapping first. It was a small sound, 1 pair of hands, and then Petra picked it up, and then Dolores from across the room, and then it moved through the staff in the uneven, organic way of genuine responses rather than performed ones. Not everyone clapped. A few people near the administrative side looked uncertain, which was honest, but most did,
and some of them looked at her with the specific expression of people who were recalibrating what they thought they'd known. Emily stood in it for the seconds it lasted. She didn't deflect it or wave it off, because that would have been its own kind of dishonesty. The performance of humility at the expense of the acknowledgement that was legitimately due. She stood in it. She let it be real. Then Carla said something else, and the room moved on, and Emily exhaled. The conversation with Deputy Director Osei happened by video call on a Friday afternoon in early December, from the small break room off the main corridor that Emily had commandeered by putting a note on the door that said, "In use," back at 2:30, which was the most effective security protocol available to her in that context. Osei was 50, precise, with the manner of someone who had spent decades reading people quickly and didn't waste language. She spent 12 minutes asking Emily questions about the access pattern methodology, not the Kane case specifically, but the underlying analytical framework, how Emily had identified the variants, what made her suspect the pattern was intentional rather than coincidental. Emily answered directly. She described the process the way it had actually happened, not the heroic version, not the modest version, just the accurate one. She'd had a hypothesis and she'd tested it against available data, and the data had confirmed it, and then she'd been careful because being wrong about a police lieutenant had different consequences than being wrong about a medication dosage. The careful part, Osei said. Walk me through how you decided what not to do. That was the most interesting question anyone had asked her, and Emily thought about it seriously before she answered. I knew that acting too early or too visibly would give Kane the opportunity to control the narrative. He already had administrative access. If I escalated formally before I had something that couldn't be explained away, I became the problem. She paused. So I kept the scope narrow. I documented what I could see from where I was standing. I didn't reach for information outside my authorized access, because anything outside that line would have been used to discredit everything inside it. Osei was quiet for a moment. And the 30 days alone, that was a choice. It was a calculated choice. I had a channel. I wasn't entirely alone, but I kept the escalation conservative because the situation required conservative escalation. Most people escalate faster, Osei said. Most people are trying to resolve the situation, Emily said. I was trying to document it. Those require different timing. Osei nodded slowly. The consulting role. I want to be specific about what it would involve. Case review. Pattern analysis on institutional misconduct cases that have medical infrastructure elements. You'd keep your nursing position. This would be parallel, contracted, your terms on availability. I'd want to stay primary in the ER, Emily said. That's not negotiable. I expected that. Then we should talk about the terms, Emily said. They talked for 40 more minutes. When the call ended, Emily sat in the break room for 3 minutes with her hands on the table, looking at nothing in particular. She was 31 years old. She had 8 years of classified military service, 3 years of civilian nursing, a federal case that had closed with 14 convictions across the primary and secondary investigations, and a consulting arrangement with a federal deputy director who had described her documentation methodology as pedagogically significant, which was a phrase Emily had never expected to be applied to anything she'd produced in a records room over 9 days while being professionally sidelined. She was also, she realized, tired in a way that was different from the operational fatigue of the last 11 weeks. This was older. The tiredness of someone who had been performing a kind of vigilance for so long that they had partially forgotten what it felt like to not be vigilant, to be in a room and not run a threat assessment, to talk to a colleague and not evaluate whether they had a secondary agenda. She thought about what it would feel like to trust that Blackstone Memorial was just a hospital now, to walk into the ER and see patients and coworkers, and the ordinary controlled chaos of emergency medicine without the layer underneath. She didn't know if she could do that. She suspected it would take time. Some things that got switched on were harder to switch off. But she was going to try. That felt important. Not the certainty of it, but the trying. That 3 weeks before Christmas, on a Wednesday night shift, Emily was at the nurse's station doing intake documentation when a woman came through the ER doors with a boy of about 7 who had a deep laceration on his palm from a broken ornament, classic holiday injury. The boy holding his wrapped hand against his chest with the focused stoicism of a child who has decided crying is no longer an option but hasn't fully committed to that position yet. Emily took them to Bay 2. She looked at the laceration, clean edges, not deep enough for anything structural to be involved, would need a few sutures and a careful clean. The boy watched her prepare the tray with the evaluating gaze of children who are deciding whether to trust a stranger based on evidence rather than instruction. "Does it hurt?" Emily asked him. "A little," he said, which she estimated meant considerably. "I'm going to clean it and put some stitches in. The numbing part stings for about 10 seconds and then it doesn't hurt anymore." She looked at him directly. "I'm going to tell you everything I'm doing before I do it, okay?" He considered this, nodded. His mother, beside him, had the particular white-knuckled calm of parents in medical situations, holding it together for the child, terror just underneath the surface. She was maybe 35, exhausted in the way of parents in December, and she looked at Emily with the gratitude that people brought into ERs along with their emergencies. "He keeps telling me he's fine," the mother said. "He is fine," Emily said. "He's also going to be more fine in about 20 minutes. The boy almost smiled. She worked carefully, talked through each step the way she'd promised. The lidocaine stung, and he held still through it with his jaw set in a way that reminded her, unexpectedly, of Sadie in bed too, pressing her call light with her good hand and asking if she was still getting her cast. The sutures were small and even, and the boy watched them go in with scientific interest once the pain was gone. "You've done this a lot," he said. "Many times," she said. "Are you good at it?" "Yes," she said without hedging, because she was, and children deserved accurate information about the people treating them. He thought about that. "My teacher says you're not supposed to brag." "I'm not bragging," Emily said. "You asked if I was good at it, and I answered honestly. There's a difference." She tied off the last suture. "There, done." He looked at his hand, then at her. "That was actually okay." "It usually is," she said. She dressed the wound, gave the discharge instructions to his mother, explained the signs to watch for, answered 3 questions about whether he could still open presents on Christmas morning. Yes, carefully, nothing requiring that hand to bear weight. The mother thanked her twice. The boy said thank you once, seriously, in the way of children who mean it when they say it. They left. Emily stripped her gloves, washed her hands, and stood at the sink in Bay 2 for a moment. This was the work. Not the 30 days of documentation, not the federal case, not the consulting arrangement with Osei's office, not the institutional apology or the formal charge nurse appointment. Those were consequences of the work. This was the work itself. A 7-year-old's hand, carefully closed. She had done both things, and she would keep doing both things, because they were not opposites. The ability to document a corrupt police lieutenant's interference pattern and the ability to tell a scared child that 10 seconds of stinging was the worst of it were both expressions of the same underlying orientation. Pay attention, be accurate, do what the situation requires. Victor Kane had called her just a nurse and had meant it as a diminishment, as a way of establishing that she was beneath his notice, manageable, an obstacle without real weight. He had been wrong about the diminishment. He had been wrong about the manageable part. But he had been right, in a way he hadn't intended, about the fact of it. She was a nurse. The just was his error. She'd never been just anything. Later, near the end of the shift, Dolores found her at the nurse's station and put a hand briefly on her shoulder, the kind of contact that carried 22 years of unspoken understanding and didn't require elaboration. "Good shift," Dolores said. "Good shift," Emily agreed. Dolores moved on. The monitors beeped in their various registers. Somewhere down the corridor, a patient was being discharged to the sound of a family member's relief. The ambulance bay doors opened and closed with the rhythm of a place that never stopped moving, never stopped needing, never ran out of the next person who required someone to pay attention and be accurate and do what the situation required. Emily picked up the next chart. The strongest person in the building, exactly as she'd always been, doing exactly what she'd always done. The world had finally caught up to that fact. It was enough.